When I opened the envelope from the landlord, my hands trembled, not because I was afraid of the contents, but because I already knew what they would say. I had pretended for weeks that things would somehow fix themselves, that I'd find a job, that the payment would magically appear in my account. But when I unfolded that letter and saw the final warning in bold black letters, it felt like my lungs forgot how to work. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the paper on the table, while the kettle behind me screamed like a siren I couldn't shut off. My husband was in the other room, humming while scrolling through his phone, unaware that I was crumbling only 10 feet away. I wanted to walk in, show him the paper, fall apart in his arms the way I used to. But I didn't. Because he hadn't asked me about my day in over a month. Because last week, when I told him I was scared, he said, "Just be grateful we have a roof over our heads." And now, I might not even have that. 3 months ago, I lost my job and I never told him. I've been waking up every morning, dressing up, leaving the house and pretending. But the truth is, I've been sitting in cafes, searching job boards, watching the numbers in our bank account shrink. And today, I realized I've run out of time. There is no next week. There is no later. And the man who owns this building, he's already knocked once. He said we should talk. I know what that means. Or at least, I think I do. But the truth is far more complicated. Let me take you back to the first time I realized that a single mistake could turn into something much, much more. But before I share my secret, tell me, have you ever made a decision so desperate, so silent, that it echoed in your life long after the moment passed? Leave your story in the comments, and let me take you back to the day it all began. The morning the letter came, I was already tired of pretending. I'd been setting an alarm at 6:30 every day, showering, putting on my makeup, styling my hair like I used to when I had meetings at the office. My husband thought I was going to work. He thought I was still employed at the same company I'd been with for 20 years. He never questioned it, never noticed the lack of stories or emails or late nights. He just kissed me on the forehead when I left and asked me to pick up milk on the way back. I didn't go to work. I went to the same coffee shop on Maple and 3rd, ordered a medium latte, and sat with my laptop for hours, scrolling through job postings that didn't want a woman my age with no recent certifications and too much experience. I sent out resumes. I even got a few phone interviews, but nothing moved forward. No one called back. 3 months. That's how long I've kept the lie alive. I told myself I just needed time. That if I could just hold out long enough, something would come through. But the rent was overdue now, and the envelope that arrived that morning didn't carry any hope. It was thick, stamped with final notice. Inside, a formal letter informing me that if I did not pay the full balance within 7 days, eviction proceedings would begin. I stared at it for 20 minutes, my coffee cold beside me. The apartment was silent except for the humming from the other room, my husband, lounging on the couch, watching videos on his phone. I had told him the electricity bill went up this month. He said, "We'll manage." The truth was, we wouldn't. I folded the letter back up and tucked it inside a cookbook in the kitchen. The irony didn't escape me, burying desperation between recipes for soufflés and roasted chicken. I went back to the bedroom and changed into sweatpants, wiped off my lipstick. I was tired of putting on a face. That afternoon, I went to see the landlord. I didn't call first. I just walked the 2 blocks to his building and rang the bell. His name wasn't on the mailbox. Just the number. Apartment 2B. He answered the door after the second ring. I'd only seen him a few times in passing. He was tall, quiet, mid-50s maybe, with skin like polished walnut and eyes that didn't blink too much. He always nodded politely when we passed in the hallway, never asked questions, never lingered. Until a few weeks ago, when he knocked on our door about a plumbing issue and said, if you need to talk, let me know. He wasn't smiling when he opened the door, but he didn't look annoyed either. Just calm. Can I help you? He asked. I held up the envelope. I got your letter. He stepped aside. Come in. His apartment smelled like eucalyptus and something else, maybe cedarwood. Clean. Uncluttered. Not cold, but minimal. I stood near the doorway while he walked to a side table and picked up a folder. I don't usually like sending those, he said. But it's policy. I understand, I said quickly. And I'm sorry. Things have been complicated. I lost my job, and I didn't tell my husband, and I've been trying to catch up, but nothing's worked, Anne. I stopped, embarrassed by how fast the words were spilling out. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He just let me speak. When I finished, he nodded once. You could have come to me earlier. I know. He opened the folder, looked at a page inside, and then set it down again. Do you have a plan? I hesitated. I thought I did. I'm still trying. He leaned against the counter. His arms were crossed, and for the first time, I noticed the way his sleeves were rolled to the elbows, his forearms smooth and strong. I looked away. I don't want to evict you, he said. That's not good for anyone. But I do need some assurance. I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek. My eyes burned. Can I have until the end of the month? I asked. There was a long pause. He studied me in that way people do when they're not sure what they're seeing yet. I'll give you a few days, he said. No pressure. Just, if there's something I can do to help, let me know. I blinked. Like what? Another pause. That's up to you. I didn't know what he meant. Or maybe I did, but didn't want to admit it to myself. His voice wasn't suggestive. Not crude. Just open-ended. As if the offer could mean anything or nothing. I left a few minutes later. He didn't follow me out. Didn't try to touch me. He just said, "Take care," and closed the door behind me. Back home, my husband was asleep on the couch, remote still in his hand, the television humming something low and meaningless. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my phone. There were no missed calls. No emails. No job offers. Just silence. My heart was pounding. I had 7 days. Maybe less. And that was the day I realized, desperation doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in quietly, breath by breath, until you stop noticing how tightly your chest is clenched. Until someone offers a different way, and you think, maybe you'll take it. The morning after my visit to his apartment, I found myself awake before dawn. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to my husband's soft snoring beside me. My body was still, but my thoughts moved like water under thin ice, fast and dangerous. I replayed the conversation again and again, the calmness in his voice, the openness in his words, and the way he had said, "That's up to you." It lingered like a question I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. The guilt should have arrived by now. That familiar wave of shame and self-loathing I used to feel whenever I thought about hiding things from my husband. But it didn't come. Not then. What I felt instead was something more confusing, something like relief. Later, I went through the motions. I packed a lunch I didn't need, put on the same black slacks and light blue blouse I wore every Wednesday, and left the apartment with a quiet "I'll see you later." My husband didn't look up from his phone. He only nodded and said, "Pick up some eggs if you pass the store." Outside, the air was cool. The sky was a dull gray, and the sidewalk still held the dampness of a light rain that must have passed through during the night. I walked with no particular destination in mind. My legs carried me through familiar streets, past shuttered shops and cafes beginning to stir. By the time I reached the park, my feet ached, and I found a bench beneath a row of trees just beginning to shed their leaves. I sat there for nearly an hour, watching the world move. Joggers passed by. A mother pushed a stroller. A man in a suit argued with someone over the phone. None of them knew that my world was coming apart in quiet pieces. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the library. Not to borrow books, I just needed a place that didn't ask questions. I sat near the back, by the tall windows, pretending to read an outdated magazine. But my mind was elsewhere. I thought about what he had said. If there's something I can do to help, let me know. It echoed in my head, not as an invitation, but as a possibility. It wasn't that I wanted to ask for help. I hated asking for anything. I had always been the one who gave it time, energy, patience. I cooked, I cleaned, I budgeted, I made holidays happen. I stretched our money until it screamed. And now, for the first time, I was the one running on empty. By the afternoon, I still hadn't come up with a plan. I stopped by a corner cafe and ordered a tea I couldn't afford, just to have something warm to hold. I watched the steam rise from the cup and felt that familiar ache settle behind my eyes. I was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that sits in your bones and whispers, "You can't keep going like this." When I got home, the apartment was quiet. My husband wasn't there. A note on the counter said he'd gone to see a friend about a project. I read it twice, as if it might contain some hidden meaning. It didn't. Just another day. Just another silence. I took off my shoes and went to the bedroom. I lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, eyes open. My mind didn't stop spinning. I thought about calling him. Not my husband, the landlord. I had his number. He'd given it to me on a slip of paper weeks ago during a plumbing issue. I'd saved it, just in case. I pulled it up on my phone, stared at the screen, then turned it off. I got up, walked into the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of everything I hadn't said to anyone. Then I heard a knock. It was soft. Not urgent. 2 polite raps, and then silence. My heart leapt before my brain caught up. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was him. I opened the door slowly. He didn't smile, didn't explain. He just said, "I was in the area. Thought I'd check in." I hesitated for a second, then stepped aside. "Come in." He walked in without a word, his eyes scanning the room, not judging, just observing. He stood in the living room, hands in his pockets. I stayed near the door, arms crossed. "I hope it's okay," he said, finally. I nodded. "It's fine." We stood there in the quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us. "I wanted to say I meant what I said yesterday," he continued. "If you need anything, help, time, even just someone to talk to, you can ask." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. He looked at me, his gaze steady but not invasive. "You don't have to decide anything today. Just think about it." I nodded again, slower this time. He took a step toward the door, then stopped. "Take care of yourself." And then, before I could think it through, before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched his arm. He turned slightly. Our eyes met. We kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. Just a moment of shared understanding, of loneliness reaching out and finding something solid to hold on to. And when it ended, he didn't ask what it meant. He didn't linger. He just touched my hand gently and said, "I'll see you soon." After he left, I stood in the middle of the room, stunned by my own stillness. I should have felt sick with guilt. I should have fallen to my knees and cried. But I didn't. I walked to the mirror in the hallway and looked at myself. My face was flushed, my eyes wide. I looked older than I remembered, but also something else. Like I had woken up from a long sleep. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was disappearing. I felt like I had made a choice. Maybe not the right one. Maybe not even a good one. But it was mine. And that, somehow, made all the difference. The days that followed were strangely quiet, not just in the apartment but inside me. It was like something had shifted, subtly, but enough to feel it in the way I moved, the way I carried my body, the way I heard silence. I expected guilt to come rushing in like a storm, fierce and immediate, but it didn't. What I felt was more confusing, a deep, aching calm, like the moment after a long cry when your chest still heaves, but the tears have stopped. I didn't talk to anyone about what happened. I didn't tell my husband, of course, and I certainly didn't reach out to any friends. What would I say? That I kissed someone I barely knew, someone who had seen more truth in me in 10 minutes than my own husband had in years? That it didn't feel like a betrayal, not exactly, but more like a break in the pattern, a sudden breath of oxygen in a room that had been sealed too long? On the surface, nothing changed. I still left the apartment every morning at the same time. I still returned home before dinner, put on a smile, cooked, cleaned, asked about my husband's day. He rarely asked about mine, and when he did, it was in the way people ask questions they don't want answers to. But I began noticing things differently. I noticed how much time he spent on his phone, scrolling, tapping, laughing silently at things I couldn't see. I noticed how we didn't touch anymore, not even the casual brushes of shoulders in the hallway, the accidental hand on the small of my back as he passed behind me in the kitchen. I noticed that he didn't look at me when he spoke, not really. His eyes hovered somewhere to the left of my face, like he was speaking to a memory of me, not the woman who stood in front of him. And I noticed something else, the way I no longer tried to fix it. There was a time I would have brought it up. I would have arranged a date night, made his favorite meal, worn something he used to like. I would have fought for us, gently, quietly, the way women are taught to. But that part of me had gone quiet. Instead, I started taking walks again. I told him I needed the exercise. He nodded, said, "Good idea," and went back to his screen. Most days I walked without direction, letting my feet decide for me. Some days I ended up near the river, watching the boats drift lazily across the water. Other days I wandered through residential streets, staring at houses I would never live in, wondering who lived inside and whether they were happy. And sometimes, though not every time, I walked past 2B. I never knocked. Not after that day. But once or twice, I saw him through the window, sitting at his small table with a book in his hand, or washing dishes at the sink. He never looked up, or if he did, I wasn't watching. And I never stayed long. Just a glance, a reminder. Of what, I wasn't even sure. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on a bench near the community garden, hands tucked into my coat sleeves, thinking about the job I no longer had. It still surprised me how quickly I'd been dismissed, no warning, no preparation. One day I was part of the team, and the next, I was just gone. It had taken me weeks to stop checking my inbox every hour, waiting for someone to write, to say it was all a mistake. But no one ever did. I looked down at my hands, at the creases forming across my knuckles, at the faint scar on my wrist from years ago when I'd burned myself taking something out of the oven. I used to think that scar was ugly. Now it felt like a reminder of how many things I'd endured without falling apart. The wind picked up, stirring the leaves at my feet. I stayed until the sun dropped behind the buildings, then made my way home. That night, my husband made a comment at dinner, something about the soup being too salty. It was a small thing, hardly worth remembering. But the way he said it, offhand, as if I hadn't been cooking for him for decades, as if this meal was just another mediocre offering, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Not sadness. Distance. After he went to bed, I sat on the couch alone and opened my laptop. I scrolled through job boards, sent 2 more applications, even though I knew they wouldn't lead anywhere. Then, without thinking, I opened a blank document and started typing. I wrote about the day I was let go. I wrote about the silence in the office, the way no one met my eyes as I packed up my desk, the way the HR manager avoided saying the word fired. I wrote about walking home with a box of my things and stopping in the middle of the sidewalk because I suddenly couldn't remember how to keep moving. I wrote for nearly an hour, and when I stopped, I felt lighter. I didn't know what the writing was for. I didn't plan to show it to anyone. But it felt good to see the truth on the page, stripped of performance. It made me wonder what else I hadn't said aloud. Over the next few days, I kept writing. Not every night, but when I could. Sometimes just a paragraph. Sometimes a page. It wasn't a journal exactly, more like fragments. Memories, thoughts, questions I couldn't answer. And slowly, without planning it, I began to write about him. Not in detail. Not about the kiss. Just small things, the way he looked at me when I spoke, like he was actually listening. The way he didn't fill silence with empty words. The way I felt around him, aware, present, real. I didn't know what it meant. I still don't. But it was there, in the words, in the space between them. One evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, my husband called out from the living room, asking if I wanted to go to a movie that weekend. I paused, a towel half folded in my hands. It was the first time in weeks he'd suggested something. The first time he'd looked up from his phone and thought of me. I said yes. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to say. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling once more, I wondered if he'd noticed how far apart we were sleeping. If he could feel the space between us, as wide and quiet as the days I spent walking, pretending to have somewhere to be. I wondered if he remembered what my voice sounded like when I laughed. Or what it looked like when I wasn't pretending. And I wondered how long I could keep all this inside before something real, finally forced its way out. The days had settled into a strange rhythm, familiar on the surface, yet utterly foreign underneath. I moved through my daily routines like an actress in a long-running play, grocery shopping with a forced smile, folding laundry with practiced hands, returning emails to no one in particular. The lie I lived had grown so thick around me that sometimes I forgot which part was real. Was I still pretending to be the same woman who used to walk into an office every morning? Or had I actually become someone new, someone uncertain, someone unfinished? I avoided walking past his apartment now. It wasn't intentional at first. The detour became automatic, like muscle memory redirecting itself to avoid a bruise. But I still felt his presence, subtle, quiet, like a note at the edge of a song you can't name. I didn't know what I wanted from him anymore. I didn't even know what I wanted from myself. That morning, my husband left early for a meeting, and I found myself alone in the apartment. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, untouched, and stared at the space across from me where he usually sat. His absence didn't feel like relief, but it wasn't exactly sorrow either. It was something quieter. Like when a clock stops ticking and you don't notice at first, until the silence becomes unbearable. I opened my laptop and looked at the documents I'd been writing. There were 5 of them now, each one scattered with half-finished thoughts, memories, phrases I couldn't explain. I reread a passage I'd written the night before, where I tried to describe the moment I stopped being afraid of my own reflection. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet morning, brushing my teeth, catching my own eyes in the mirror and realizing I didn't flinch. I closed the laptop. That morning, I didn't want to write. I wanted to move. I changed into jeans and a sweater, pulled on my boots, and left the apartment with no plan in mind. The city felt heavy that day, the sky overcast, the light thick and colorless. I walked without purpose, turning corners by instinct, avoiding crowds. My phone buzzed in my pocket once, then again, messages from my husband, something about dinner, but I didn't look. I ended up at the small public garden near the train tracks, a place I hadn't visited in years. There were no flowers this time of year, just brittle stems and dry soil, but the benches were still there, and the path still curved like old memories. I sat down and let my shoulders drop. A breeze stirred the branches above me, and with it came an unexpected thought: what if I didn't go home tonight? Not to leave. Not to run away. But just to see what it felt like, disappearing for a few hours, stepping out of the roles I played without ever auditioning. The thought was absurd, childish even. But it clung to me. I stood up and began walking again. I don't know why I walked the direction I did. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all. Maybe something inside me had already decided. By the time I looked up and realized where I was standing outside his building. It was quiet. No sign of movement behind the windows. I felt the weight of hesitation rise in my chest, tight, familiar, protective. I could turn around now and no one would know. I could erase this moment with a few steps. But I didn't move. Instead, I sat down on the low stone ledge beside the front steps and stared at the sidewalk. The air smelled faintly of laundry detergent and autumn, of something warm fading. I watched the leaves gather in slow spirals near the curb and tried to remember what it felt like to be certain about anything. After what felt like an hour, I stood up and walked away. I didn't knock. Later that evening, back in my apartment, I reheated leftovers and sat alone at the table. My husband had texted to say he'd be late. I didn't ask why. I didn't care. I ate slowly, without tasting anything, and washed the dishes with numb hands. Afterward, I curled up on the couch with a blanket and opened a book I'd been meaning to read. I didn't get past the first chapter. My thoughts were too loud. I kept thinking about the moment on the sidewalk, how I'd stood in front of his building, paralyzed not by fear, but by choice. I had wanted to see him. To talk. Maybe even to explain something I didn't yet understand. But I hadn't done it. I had chosen silence. And yet, that silence was different than before. It wasn't the silence of hiding, it was the silence of waiting. Of not knowing what came next, but finally being willing to admit it. The next morning, I woke up early again, before the alarm. I lay still for a while, listening to the familiar creaks of the building, the cars outside, the distant hum of someone's radio. My husband stirred beside me but didn't wake. I got up, showered, dressed. This time, I didn't take my usual route. I walked along quieter streets, avoiding intersections where I might run into neighbors. I passed a bakery and inhaled the scent of fresh bread, considered stopping, then kept walking. I didn't want comfort. I wanted clarity. I sat in the park again, not on the bench from before, but on the grass near a tree. I pulled out my notebook, something I hadn't used in years, and began writing. Not on the laptop. Not for anyone else. Just pen and paper, the way I used to when I was younger and still believed my thoughts mattered. I wrote about silence. About the silence in my marriage, in my home, in my chest. About the way we fill our lives with noise to avoid hearing the things that scare us. About how sometimes a kiss isn't about desire, but about feeling seen. About how loneliness doesn't always look like sadness, it often looks like routine. I wrote until my hand ached. And when I stopped, I closed the notebook, held it in my lap, and stared at the pages. I wasn't sure what I would do next. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of not knowing. I was still lost. But I had stopped pretending I wasn't. It had been a week since I stood outside his building and walked away. I hadn't seen him since, hadn't passed by again, hadn't reached out. But I thought about him more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't the kiss that stayed with me. It was everything around it. The stillness in his presence. The absence of judgment. The strange comfort of being acknowledged without expectation. At home, nothing had changed. Or maybe everything had, but only inside me. My husband remained as consistent as ever, coming and going, commenting on headlines, asking if there was more coffee. We moved around each other like people in a narrow hallway, turning sideways just enough to avoid touching. I continued pretending to go to work. The performance had become so seamless that sometimes even I forgot it was a lie. I'd sit in the same coffee shop on 3rd Street, scrolling through job boards, applying to positions I knew I wouldn't get. Not because I wasn't qualified. But because I wasn't what they were looking for, middle-aged, out of fashion, forgettable. The more I looked, the more invisible I felt. One morning, I decided not to take my usual seat by the window. Instead, I walked to the other end of the city and sat in a small diner I'd never been to before. The kind with cracked leather booths and servers who didn't smile unless they meant it. I ordered black coffee and stared out the window at the slow parade of strangers. I wasn't waiting for anyone, but my eyes kept drifting to the door, half expecting someone to walk in. No one did. When I got home that evening, my husband was in the kitchen. He had ordered takeout, and 2 boxes sat on the counter unopened. He looked up as I entered. "I got your favorite," he said, pointing to one of the boxes. I nodded, set down my bag, and began putting away the few groceries I had picked up on the way home. He watched me for a moment, then added, "You've been quiet lately." I didn't respond. Not out of defiance, but because I didn't know how to answer a question that wasn't really a question. After a long pause, he walked to the living room and turned on the TV. The sound of sports commentary filled the apartment, familiar and dull. Later that night, as we lay in bed, he reached for me. It wasn't forceful or aggressive. Just a quiet, tentative movement, like he was trying to bridge the gap that had formed between us. I didn't pull away. But I didn't lean in either. I let his hand rest on my hip, unmoving, and stared at the ceiling while he whispered my name, like it would wake something in me that had long gone silent. We kissed. It wasn't passionate. It wasn't even tender. It was a gesture, a placeholder, an echo of something that used to live between us but had grown thin and tired with time. Afterward, he turned on his side and fell asleep quickly. I remained awake, eyes open in the dark, the kiss still lingering, not on my lips, but in the space between who I used to be and who I had become. In the morning, I left early. I walked for almost an hour before I realized where my feet had taken me. The streets were still wet from an early drizzle, and the air carried that heavy, metallic scent that comes after rain. I passed the grocery store, the library, the closed bakery on the corner. And then, without deciding to, I turned down the street that led to his building. He was outside, standing near the curb with a set of keys in his hand, unlocking the door of an old hatchback. He looked up at the sound of my steps and froze, just for a second. Neither of us spoke. He nodded once, a small, respectful, not assuming anything. I walked past him, and he didn't follow. But I turned back after a few steps, stood there for a long breath, and said quietly, "Do you have a few minutes?" He nodded again. We walked in silence to the small park 2 blocks away and sat on the same bench I'd occupied weeks earlier, when my thoughts were a mess of questions and fears. "I'm not sure why I came," I said, staring at my hands. You don't have to explain, he said. But I wanted to. Not to justify anything, but to be honest. At least once. I've been pretending, I said. For a long time. Not just with my husband. With everyone. Even myself. And I think I'm tired. He didn't respond. He just let the words hang in the air, heavy and fragile. I used to know who I was, I continued. I had routines, responsibilities, a purpose. And then, somewhere along the way, I started disappearing. Not all at once. Just slowly. Quietly. He turned his head toward me, not saying anything, but listening in a way that made me feel like my words had weight. I keep thinking about that day, I said, finally. About the kiss. About how it wasn't planned. About how I didn't feel like I was doing something wrong. We kissed, he said simply. And something in the way he said it, without shame, without regret, made my chest tighten. I don't know what I want from you, I said honestly. I don't even know what I want from myself. But I needed to see you. He nodded, then looked down at the ground, the corner of his mouth turning slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. I'm not expecting anything, he said. I just wanted you to know that you're not invisible. The words landed gently, but they cracked something open inside me. I blinked hard, trying to keep the tears from falling, but one escaped, tracing a quiet path down my cheek. We sat in silence for a while after that. Two people in a public park, barely touching, barely speaking, but sharing something neither of us could name. When I finally stood to leave, I didn't promise to call. He didn't ask to see me again. There was no plan, no resolution. Just an understanding that whatever was between us hadn't ended, it had only begun. I walked home slowly, feeling more grounded than I had in months. That night, as I made dinner, my husband asked if I wanted to visit his sister's place over the weekend. I said maybe. It wasn't a no. But it wasn't a yes either. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his phone. And I stood there, stirring the soup, feeling the quiet truth bloom inside me. I didn't belong entirely in either world, not with him, and not yet with the man who had shown me something I thought I'd lost. I belonged somewhere in between. And for now, that was enough. It was a Tuesday when my husband suggested a weekend getaway. We were sitting at the kitchen table, eating in near silence, when he looked up from his plate and said we could drive out to the coast for a night or two. I don't know what surprised me more, his sudden interest in spending time together or the way he avoided looking directly at me when he said it. I didn't answer right away. I just nodded and kept eating, letting the suggestion hang there, unconfirmed and unresolved. Later, while doing the dishes, I thought about the way his voice had sounded, tentative, almost rehearsed. There was a time when spontaneous trips had been his thing. He'd show up after work with an idea, a bag already packed, and a grin that made me feel 17 again. But this wasn't that. This felt like a patch, a thin attempt to sew together something that had already torn too wide. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my side, facing away from him, eyes open in the dark. His breathing was steady, and the faint blue glow of his phone screen lit the wall above our bed as he scrolled through news or videos or whatever had become more engaging than the woman next to him. At some point, he put the phone down and shifted toward me. His hand brushed against my back, but it didn't settle there. He turned over again, and we both drifted into silence. The next morning, I took the long way on my walk. I didn't mean to. My feet just moved, weaving through side streets and empty sidewalks, until I found myself standing in front of the building again. The same one I had once sworn to avoid. The windows looked the same. The street hadn't changed. But I had. I didn't knock. I just stood there for a moment, heart slow but heavy, and then turned and walked away. I didn't need to see him. I only needed to remember that I could. When I got home, my husband had already left for work. He'd made a pot of coffee and left a note on the counter. Thinking about that trip, what do you think? I stared at the handwriting for a long time. It looked rushed, almost casual, as if he wasn't sure whether he really wanted the answer. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, holding the mug with both hands, the steam rising between my fingers. I couldn't remember the last time I had truly looked forward to anything. Most days were just a series of tasks strung together: wake, walk, pretend, cook, sleep. The idea of leaving town, even briefly, stirred something unfamiliar in me. Not hope. Not dread. Just the question, for whose sake would I be going? Later that day, I opened my laptop and tried to apply for another job. It was a position I had already applied to once, months ago, but I rewrote the cover letter and submitted it anyway. I didn't believe it would lead anywhere. But the act of doing it, of trying, gave me a temporary sense of order. I spent the afternoon cleaning. Not because it needed to be done, but because the movement gave me something to hold on to. I scrubbed the bathroom tile until my knuckles hurt. I wiped the windows until my reflection was clearer than the view beyond them. I rearranged a drawer I hadn't opened in years and found a photo of us, my husband and I, taken on a beach during our first year of marriage. I looked young in the photo. He looked happy. I set it aside and kept cleaning. When he came home that evening, he seemed lighter. He kissed my cheek, complimented the smell of dinner, even asked how my day had been. I answered vaguely. It was easier than telling the truth. Over dinner, he brought up the trip again. He said we could leave Friday after work, come back Sunday. Just the two of us, he said, with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I told him I'd think about it. And I did. I thought about it that night as I lay in bed, and the night after that. I thought about the miles we'd drive in silence, the hotel room with one bed, the empty beaches that wouldn't feel like a vacation. I thought about pretending to be excited, about the forced laughter and hollow attempts to reconnect. And I thought about the difference between being together and simply not being apart. By Thursday, I had made my decision. But I didn't tell him. Not yet. Instead, I spent the day in the park again, sitting beneath the same tree, notebook in hand. I wrote about the kitchen table, the quiet car rides, the way I used to believe love was a thing that lived in gestures, a hand on the back, a warm meal, a shared joke. But love, I realized, wasn't the absence of harm. It was presence. And that, more than anything, had gone missing. When I got home, my husband was packing a small duffel bag. I stood in the doorway and watched him fold shirts he hadn't worn in years. He looked up and smiled. Almost ready, he said. We'll leave right after dinner tomorrow. I nodded. That night, I didn't sleep again. But this time, I didn't stay in bed. I got up quietly, pulled on my coat, and left the apartment. I walked without purpose, letting the cold air clear my head. The city was quieter at night, less demanding, less bright. I passed familiar places, the diner, the library, the coffee shop, and eventually found myself outside the building again. The streetlight buzzed above me. I didn't go inside. But I didn't leave either. I sat on the stoop, pulled my coat tight around me, and closed my eyes. I stayed there for a long time. Not because I was lost. But because I was finally learning how to sit still inside the truth. I didn't come home that night until the sky began to shift from black to gray. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few delivery trucks and the distant rumble of early commuters. My fingers were numb, my legs heavy, but there was something grounding about the cold, something clarifying. I didn't feel lost anymore. I felt finished. Not in the sense of being defeated, but more like a chapter that had finally come to its end. I was ready to turn the page, even if I didn't know what came next. When I let myself back into the apartment, I moved quietly, like a stranger in my own space. My husband was still asleep. His bag was zipped and propped by the door, his shoes neatly placed beside it. On the kitchen counter, a folded itinerary sat next to 2 travel mugs and a handwritten list of things we might want to do: hikes, cafes, coastal drives. He had tried. That much was clear. But I couldn't go. Not like this. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant buzz of morning traffic. For a moment, I just breathed. In and out. Slow and steady. I had rehearsed the conversation a dozen times in my head. None of the versions were easy. But none of them involved packing a bag and pretending to be someone I wasn't anymore. I stood and walked to the bedroom. He was still curled on his side, the sheet half fallen from his shoulder, one hand tucked beneath his cheek. There was a softness to him in sleep that I rarely saw when he was awake. I used to reach for that version of him, years ago, like a place I could return to. But now, he felt more like a photo, familiar but distant, still but unreachable. I showered, changed clothes, and wrote a note. I kept it short. I need to take some time for myself. I'm okay. I just can't go away with you right now. I hope you'll understand. I left it on the pillow beside him and closed the door behind me. The walk across town was quiet. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone. I just moved, each step a small affirmation that I was choosing this, not out of impulse, not out of guilt, but because it was the only thing that felt honest. When I reached his building, I hesitated at the door. I hadn't planned what I would say. I wasn't even sure if he'd be there. But this time, I didn't turn away. I rang the buzzer and waited. He opened the door still in his sweatshirt and loose pants, like he had just woken up. His expression didn't change, no surprise, no confusion. Just calm, steady recognition. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't need to. I stepped inside, and he closed the door behind me. The apartment was warm. A small lamp cast a soft glow over the furniture, and there was a faint scent of coffee and wood. I stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, listening to the quiet. Then I sat down on the edge of his couch. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We spent the night together. It wasn't an escape. It wasn't an affair in the way people like to define them, with scandal and betrayal and whispered secrets. It was something else. Something quieter. More deliberate. A moment of being seen, not just watched. Of being chosen, not out of need or convenience, but out of recognition. In the morning, I woke up before him. Light spilled through the slats of the blinds, striping the walls in soft lines. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, staring at my hands. They looked the same as always, veined, worn, strong. But I felt different in them. Like I had reclaimed them from years of use without acknowledgement. He stirred beside me but didn't speak. I could feel the quiet awareness in the room, the understanding that this moment didn't need to be explained or named. I stood and gathered my things. He walked me to the door, barefoot and silent. At the threshold, he paused and looked at me. Not expectant. Not worried. Just present. Take care of yourself, he said. I will, I replied. And I meant it. Back outside, the day had fully arrived. The city was alive again, buses hissing to stops, kids with backpacks moving in flocks, shop doors unlocking with dull metallic clicks. I walked home through the noise, unbothered by it for the first time in weeks. The chaos felt oddly comforting. I was part of it, not running from it. When I returned to the apartment, the bedroom door was open. The bed was made. My husband was gone. On the kitchen counter, next to the cold coffee pot, was a note in his handwriting. I understand. I'll be at my sister's for the weekend. I stared at the words, rereading them more than once. There was no anger in them. No pleading. Just acceptance. I folded the note and placed it in the drawer with the others I hadn't yet thrown away, the eviction notice, the rejection letters, the list of bills I couldn't pay. All the pieces of a life I was slowly gathering the courage to rebuild. I spent the rest of the day alone. I cleaned the apartment again, not out of panic or guilt, but because I wanted the space to feel mine. I lit a candle I had been saving. I opened the windows and let in the afternoon air. I sat down at my laptop and began to write, not a cover letter, not a resume, but something real. I didn't know if it would become anything. I didn't care. The act of writing was enough. And when the sun began to set, casting golden light across the floor, I didn't feel regret. Only stillness. Only truth. The following days passed with an odd sense of clarity. It wasn't peace, at least not the kind you read about in books where a woman makes a brave decision and the world suddenly aligns itself to reward her, but it was quieter. Like a room that had been emptied of clutter, where you could finally hear your own footsteps again. I didn't reach out to either of them. Not the man whose presence had broken something open in me, and not the man I had once vowed to grow old with. Both existed in their own quiet corners of my life now, one past, one undefined. I stayed inside for the better part of the weekend, cleaning, sorting, and mostly writing. There was comfort in the rhythm of it, opening drawers, discarding expired things, folding old sweaters I hadn't worn in years. But the comfort wasn't in the tasks. It was in the space I was finally making, both physically and inside myself. By Monday morning, I had decided to return to the employment center. It had been weeks since I last went. I told myself it was because the job postings were outdated, the workshops redundant, but the truth was more uncomfortable. I didn't want to be seen. Not in that way. Not as someone looking. Someone failing. But now, I was ready to be looked at again, even if the gaze was impersonal and bureaucratic. I dressed in muted tones, something neat but not new, and walked across town with a purposeful stride I hadn't felt in months. The building hadn't changed. The receptionist still wore the same tired expression, the waiting chairs were still arranged in anxious little rows, and the smell of paper and cheap hand sanitizer still clung to the air like a reminder of routines. I filled out another form, waited 37 minutes, then sat across from a woman who asked the same questions I'd heard before. I answered plainly, without performance. No embellishments. No apologies. She typed my responses with a kind of detached efficiency that I found oddly reassuring. Afterward, I stopped by the library. Not to use the computers or check out books, but just to sit. The quiet inside was different than the quiet of home. It was layered, whispers, footsteps, the faint click of keyboards. I found a seat near the window and opened my notebook. I didn't write about him. Or my husband. Or the weekend I'd spent alone. I wrote about the moment in the kitchen, the scent of burnt coffee, the folded note by the bed. I wrote about the silence between two people who once shared everything, and the way silence could grow roots, deep and unseen, until it separated the floor beneath your feet. I wrote for nearly an hour, then closed the notebook and left. On my way home, I passed the market. I hadn't planned to stop, but I stepped inside anyway, letting the familiarity of fluorescent lights and background music wrap around me like an old routine. I picked up a few things, apples, bread, tea, and paused by the canned soup aisle. My husband used to joke about how I always bought too many. I stood there for a moment, fingers grazing the labels, then moved on. Back at the apartment, I noticed the shift the moment I stepped inside. It wasn't anything obvious. Nothing had been moved. But the air felt different. As if the walls were holding their breath. I set the groceries down and found a note on the table. I'll be back Wednesday. Take the time you need. I stared at the words, not sure whether to feel gratitude or guilt. I felt neither. Just something close to neutrality. It was strange, realizing how little weight his absence carried now. Once, it would have felt like a loss. Now, it just felt like space. I spent the evening doing small things. Reorganizing the kitchen drawers. Watering the plant I had forgotten by the window. Rereading an old novel I never finished. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wait for a knock. I just moved from one hour to the next with the strange steadiness of someone no longer afraid of silence. The next day, I woke early and walked to the park. The air had turned cooler overnight, and the leaves were beginning to curl at the edges, crisp with the promise of a coming season. I sat on my usual bench, pulled my coat tight, and watched people pass, mothers with strollers, teenagers dragging their feet, old men walking dogs that looked older than they did. I thought about calling him. Not to ask for anything. Not to explain. Just to say, I'm still here. But I didn't. Instead, I walked to the edge of the park and stood near the fountain, letting the spray catch the hem of my coat. I hadn't planned what happened next. I didn't even realize where I was going until I found myself back on that familiar street, in front of the building with the scratched red door. I didn't ring the buzzer. I didn't need to. He stepped out just as I approached, holding a small bag of trash, like it was the most ordinary timing in the world. We looked at each other for a long moment. No smiles. No questions. Then he said, "You look different." And I did. Not because I was happier. Not because I had figured anything out. But because I had stopped hiding, even from myself. I nodded once, a soft acknowledgement, then turned to walk away. But after a few steps, I stopped. "I'm not running anymore," I said without turning back. "I know," he said behind me. And that was enough. The rest of the day unfolded slowly. I walked home with steady feet, unpacked the groceries I'd forgotten in the fridge, and opened the windows to let the afternoon air in. I cooked for one, sat at the table alone, and didn't feel lonely. That night, I pulled out my notebook again. I didn't write about anyone else. I wrote about me. Not the woman I used to be, or the one everyone expected. Just the version who sat in the quiet and chose not to leave. By Wednesday morning, I knew my husband would return. I didn't check the clock, didn't text or ask when. I just knew. The apartment had taken on a kind of waiting stillness, like the air itself was bracing for something, words, explanations, maybe just footsteps in the hall that would sound different now than they did before. I had no script prepared. I didn't rehearse anything. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to say. But I had promised myself I wouldn't lie anymore, not even in silence. The day moved slowly, as if it knew what was coming and didn't want to arrive too soon. I cleaned again, not to impress or to distract, but because movement helped me stay grounded. I changed the sheets, wiped down the counters, watered the plant by the window. I didn't try to make the space feel warm. I just wanted it to feel honest. By late afternoon, I was sitting on the couch with a cup of tea, watching the light stretch long across the living room rug. I heard the lock turn before I saw him. When the door opened, he stepped inside without hesitation, as if the days apart had never happened. He looked tired, not physically, but in that deep, quiet way that settles in the corners of someone's expression when they've been thinking too much. He set his bag down by the door and glanced at me. I looked back. Neither of us spoke. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, then leaned against the counter and let out a slow breath. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said. "I wasn't either," I replied. He nodded once, as if he understood more than my words gave away. He came into the living room but didn't sit. He stood near the window, watching the street below. "I thought the trip might help," he said after a long pause. "Maybe remind us." I didn't ask what he thought we needed reminding of. He wouldn't have been able to name it. "I know I've been distant," he added. "I don't say things the way I should. Maybe I got too used to thinking we'd always be fine." His voice was calm, but it carried a weight I hadn't heard in a long time. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't even an apology. It was something simpler, truth. I set my tea down and stood. "I've been pretending," I said. "To you." "To myself. I lost my job months ago and didn't tell you. I've been leaving every day like I still had somewhere to be." He turned to me, eyebrows tightening, but didn't interrupt. "I was afraid," I continued. "Afraid that if I said it out loud, it would make it real. And I couldn't deal with that. Not when everything else already felt so quiet." His face softened, but he still didn't speak. "I kissed someone," I said. "There." It was done. He blinked slowly, as if the words had taken a moment to reach him. "I'm not proud of it," I added. "But I'm not sorry either." Because for the first time in a long time, I felt awake. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was still. Settled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask who or when or why. He just sat on the edge of the chair across from me, resting his elbows on his knees. "I think I knew," he said finally. "Not about the kiss. But that something was missing." He looked down at his hands. "I didn't know how to ask you what you needed. I thought giving you space meant I was being respectful. I didn't realize it just made me invisible to you." We sat like that for a while. Two people in a room that had held years of shared moments, now suddenly filled with things unsaid. "I don't hate you," he said quietly. "I'm not leaving." I nodded. "I'm not asking you to." "But something has to change," he added. "Yes," I said. "It does." We didn't define what that meant, not in that moment. The conversation wasn't a solution. It was an opening. A small, cautious beginning. That evening, we didn't cook. We ordered takeout and ate in silence, not awkward, just thoughtful. After dinner, he washed the dishes while I folded a few towels in the hallway closet. The rhythm of ordinary things returned, but not in the way it used to. There was space between us now. Not distance, space. For breathing. For rethinking. Later, he went to bed early. I stayed up, sitting by the window, watching the lights across the street flicker on one by one. I didn't feel triumphant or relieved. But I felt honest. The next morning, I woke up before him and left a note on the counter. "Going for a walk. I'll be back." The air outside was crisp, and the sun had just started warming the buildings along the east side. I walked without music, without distraction, letting the noise of the city move around me. I passed the cafe, the bus stop, the dry cleaner with the faded awning. Familiar places that had somehow become neutral ground. I found myself near the park, near the bench where I had spent so many mornings trying to understand what had gone wrong inside me. I sat, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders, and watched the wind stir the fallen leaves. A few minutes passed before I saw him. Not by accident. He was walking his usual route, coffee in hand, eyes on the path. When he saw me, he paused but didn't change course. He approached slowly, respectfully. I looked up, nodded once. He didn't sit. I didn't ask him to. We stood like that, me on the bench, him by the edge of the path, for what felt like a long time. Then I said, I told him. He nodded, understanding what I meant. I'm not sure what happens next, I added. You don't have to be, he said. Not today. And then he walked on. I sat there long after he disappeared from view, the echo of our brief exchange still in my chest. It wasn't closure. It wasn't goodbye. It was another truth spoken without shame. And that, more than anything, felt like the beginning of something real. The first morning of real quiet came a few days after that conversation in the park. Not the kind of quiet that grows out of avoidance or tension, but the kind that arrives when something inside has finally settled. It was subtle, there was still noise outside, the usual passing traffic, footsteps in the hallway, the whir of the radiator, but none of it pressed in on me like it used to. The silence within was no longer empty. It was earned. My husband and I had returned to a shared space that wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was honest. We still spoke little, but when we did, the words had weight. The conversations weren't rushed or padded with small talk. We talked about practical things, bills, groceries, next week's plans, but we also talked about things we had ignored for too long. What we had become. What we wanted to keep. What we no longer had the strength to carry. He didn't ask me to promise anything. And I didn't pretend to. The nights were still quiet. We slept in the same bed, but not always on the same side. Sometimes we reached for each other in small ways, a brush of fingers when passing in the hallway, a shared glance across the table, but there was no pressure. No expectation that what we once had would return just because we were trying. That was the hardest truth of all to accept, that effort doesn't always restore what time has taken. But it can build something new. That week, I applied for 2 jobs that didn't make me feel small. I rewrote my resume, stripped of the apologetic tone I had used before. I didn't list every duty I had performed. I listed the things I had carried. The weight I had held. The decisions I had made in silence. I stopped trying to sound eager and started trying to sound real. I also went back to writing. Not every day, and not with any purpose beyond reflection, but I no longer questioned its value. It was no longer an escape. It was a mirror. I filled pages with thoughts I hadn't realized were waiting to be spoken, about aging, and loneliness, and invisible labor. About what it meant to lose your role in the world, and to still find yourself standing. About choosing something for yourself, even if no one else understands. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table folding a pile of laundry, my husband walked in holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one down beside me and sat without a word. We drank in silence. It wasn't warm or romantic. It was 2 people sharing air, trying not to break what had been slowly rebuilt. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "If you ever want to leave, I won't stop you." I folded a towel, placed it on the stack, and looked up at him. "I know," I said. And I did. It was not permission. It was acknowledgement. He was saying he saw me. That he understood I was no longer someone who could be contained by vows made decades ago, especially not if those vows had become more about memory than choice. But I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not for him, not for the man in the building across town, not even for myself. I needed to stay a little longer, not because of fear, or habit, or guilt, but because I was still learning who I was within this version of my life. And sometimes staying is not about holding on. Sometimes it's about seeing clearly what must change, and choosing to remain just long enough to make peace with it. Later that night, I sat by the window again, notebook in my lap, the pages almost filled. I didn't write about the kiss anymore. Or the man whose calmness had cracked something open in me. or the lie I had lived for 3 months after losing my job. I didn't need to relive those things. They had already served their purpose. Instead, I wrote about the walk I had taken that afternoon. About a woman I saw sitting at a bus stop with 3 heavy bags and a face lined with the kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. She had looked at me as I passed, just a second, no more, and I felt something pass between us. A flicker of recognition. Not as strangers, but as women who had, at some point, quietly fallen out of their own lives. I wanted to go back and say something to her. Anything. But I kept walking. That night, I wrote the words I wished I had said. You're not invisible. You don't need to keep proving your usefulness. You are still allowed to want more. I left the page open on the table and went to bed. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself for a long time. There were still lines I hadn't seen 5 years ago, still shadows that hadn't faded. But there was also steadiness. There was no makeup, no performance. Just a woman who had stopped asking for permission to exist. I made breakfast. My husband joined me. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. We spoke about the weather. About a new bakery opening down the street. About how the city always seemed to skip over spring and go straight from winter to summer. And that, somehow, felt like a beginning. Later that afternoon, I walked past his building again. I didn't expect to see him, and I didn't. I didn't ring. I didn't pause. I kept walking. Not because I was moving away from something. But because, for the first time in a long time, I was walking towards something that felt like my own life. Not borrowed. Not forgotten. Not compromised. Mine.